The evening descended on Thornfield Manor with the kind of gentleness that only English autumn could provide. The ladies had departed by 4:30, their motor cars crunching along the gravel drive as the light began its inevitable fade toward dusk. Miss Marple had accepted Catherine's invitation to stay for dinner, an invitation that carried all the weight of social obligation disguised as hospitality, and she had returned to her cottage only to collect an overnight bag and a fresh change of clothes. She found herself now in the guest bedroom on the first floor, a room decorated in shades of cream and pale blue that suggested considerable expense and considerable impersonality. Nothing in the room bore any mark of individual preference. It might have been any guest room in any manor house in England. Miss Marple rather admired this about Catherine. She understood the value of not revealing oneself through one's surroundings. The dinner was announced at 7 o'clock, and Miss Marple made her way downstairs with the careful deliberation of age, allowing the banister to bear her weight. The dining room at Thornfield was impressive in the way that rooms designed to impress generally are. Too large for genuine comfort, too formal for genuine conversation. A chandelier cast crystalline light across a table that could seat 20, but tonight held only 5 place settings. Thomas Ashworth sat at the head of the table, Catherine to his right. Diana occupied the position opposite Miss Marple, while Margaret had been placed at the far end, a seating arrangement that struck Miss Marple as deliberately isolating. Young Miss Ashworth seemed to accept this positioning with the resignation of someone accustomed to finding herself on the periphery of family gatherings. The soup course arrived, consommé with an artistic garnish, and the conversation began with the predictable pleasantries that characterized formal dining among the English upper classes. The weather had been favorable. The gardens were indeed remarkable. The village seemed to be thriving, though one did miss certain of the old families who had moved away. It was Margaret who introduced the discordant note. "I received a letter from London today," she said quietly, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. "From my solicitor." The temperature of the room seemed to alter perceptibly. Thomas's hand stilled. Catherine's smile became more fixed, more deliberately maintained. Diana's attention, which had previously been directed toward her soup, suddenly focused with laser intensity on her niece. "How pleasant for you," Catherine said, her voice carrying that particular quality of brightness that indicated its opposite. "I do hope matters are progressing satisfactorily." "They are, actually," Margaret replied, meeting her aunt's gaze. "My father's estate is being settled. Apparently there were certain provisions in his will that nobody had quite understood before." Miss Marple continued, eating her soup with undiminished attention to its delicate flavor. She did not look up. She did not need to. She could observe everything perfectly well through the peripheral awareness that 70 years of village life had honed into an almost supernatural skill. "How interesting," Thomas said, and there was something in his tone that suggested it was anything but. "Your father was a complicated man." "Yes," Margaret agreed, "he was, though perhaps not complicated in the ways people assumed." The soup bowls were cleared. The fish course arrived, sole meunière, perfectly prepared and entirely unappetizing given the sudden tension that had settled over the table like a physical presence. Miss Marple noted that Catherine had pushed her plate away after a single bite, claiming fatigue from the afternoon's entertaining. Diana was eating with mechanical precision, as though fueling her body were a duty rather than a pleasure. "And what precisely did these provisions entail?" Thomas asked, his tone now deliberately casual in a way that suggested intense calculation beneath the surface. "My solicitor prefers to discuss such matters in person," Margaret said. "I shall be traveling to London next week." "How extraordinarily inconvenient," Catherine murmured. "We had hoped you might stay through the autumn. The village becomes so pleasant once the summer visitors have departed." Margaret smiled slightly. "I rather think some time away would be beneficial for everyone." The remainder of dinner proceeded with the strained courtesy of people engaged in a complex negotiation they could not openly acknowledge. Miss Marple observed the unspoken communication that passed between Thomas and Diana, a glance that lasted perhaps 2 seconds but contained volumes. She observed the way Catherine's left hand trembled slightly as she lifted her wine-glass, though her right remained perfectly steady. She observed the calculated distance Margaret maintained between herself and the rest of the family, as though she had already mentally departed. When the meal concluded and the ladies retired to the drawing-room, following a tradition that seemed anachronistic in 1952 but which Catherine maintained with religious fervour, Miss Marple settled herself into her chintz chair and accepted a cup of tea that she noticed was placed by Catherine's own hand, slightly to the left of its saucer. Outside, the November night had turned cold. The wind moved through the gardens, disturbing the carefully arranged roses, scattering petals across the perfect lawn. It was the kind of evening that suggested change, upheaval, the disruption of established order. Miss Marple sipped her tea and thought about inheritance, about family secrets, about the particular vulnerabilities of women who found themselves financially independent for perhaps the first time in their lives. She thought about the careful calculations that must have been made in this house and the desperation that sometimes arose when calculations began to fail. She wondered what would happen next, though in truth, she suspected she already knew. The night at Thornfield Manor unfolded with the peculiar quietness that characterizes old houses when their occupants have retired to their respective chambers. Miss Marple lay in the guest bed, listening to the sounds that such houses make, the settling of timber, the distant murmur of wind through corridors, the occasional creak of floorboards as someone moved through the darkness. She did not sleep, though she maintained the appearance of someone who might. Long experience had taught her that observation conducted in the hours between midnight and dawn often yielded insights that daylight obscured. It was approximately 2 o'clock when she heard the argument. The voices were muffled by walls and distance, but the drawing-room lay directly beneath her room, and sound carried upward through the ancient house with remarkable clarity. She recognized Thomas's voice first, raised, controlled fury replacing his usual urbane tone. Then Catherine's response, higher-pitched and trembling with an emotion Miss Marple recognized as fear rather than anger. "You cannot possibly believe she won't discover it," Catherine was saying. "She's already suspicious. The solicitor wouldn't have contacted her unless—" "Unless what?" Thomas interrupted. "Unless her father's provisions were substantial? Yes, Catherine, that rather appears to be the case. Which is precisely why we must handle this with considerably more delicacy than you're currently demonstrating." "Delicacy?" Catherine's voice had risen further. "Thomas, that money was supposed to be— It was meant to secure our position. We discussed this. We agreed." "We agreed to nothing," he said coldly. "I made a decision. There is a considerable difference." There was a silence then, the kind that follows when one party has won an argument through sheer force of will rather than through superior reasoning. Miss Marple heard the sound of a door opening, footsteps retreating, then Catherine's muffled sobs, quickly suppressed, as though she had suddenly remembered that vulnerability was a luxury she could not afford. Miss Marple remained awake, her mind working through the implications of what she had heard. Margaret's inheritance was significant. Thomas and Catherine required money. These facts combined to create a particular type of pressure, the kind that made otherwise respectable people capable of actions they would never have considered under less desperate circumstances. She had seen it before in St. Mary Mead, the Winstons who had embezzled from the church fund, and the Hendersons whose financial desperation had led to a marriage that was really a calculated seduction. The morning arrived grey and damp, the kind of English November morning that seemed to drain colour from the world. Miss Marple dressed carefully and made her way downstairs where she found Thomas already at breakfast, reading the Times with the absorption of someone intent on avoiding conversation. Catherine appeared shortly thereafter, her makeup applied with meticulous precision, her appearance suggesting that she had either not slept or had employed considerable artistry to conceal the fact. Margaret was absent from breakfast. "Perhaps Miss Margaret is sleeping late," Miss Marple ventured gently, accepting a cup of tea from Catherine's hands. She noted that the cup was placed in its proper position this morning, directly centered on the saucer. The return to normalcy was, she suspected, quite deliberate. "Margaret keeps her own schedule," Catherine said with a brightness that sounded forced. "She's always been rather independent." It was Diana who provided the information that altered everything. She arrived at Thornfield just after 9 o'clock, driving her Morris Minor with characteristic disregard for the speed limits, her face bearing an expression that suggested significant agitation. "Has anyone seen Margaret this morning?" she asked without preamble, her usual reserve abandoned. "Not since last evening," Thomas replied. He was watching Diana with particular intensity, Miss Marple noted. "Why? Has something occurred?" "I went to her room to ask about London," Diana said, still breathless from her drive, "to offer her some recommendations. The door was locked, but when I put my ear to it, I could hear water running." "The bathroom water. It's been running for at least 10 minutes, I should think." Catherine set down her teacup with a sharp click. Thomas rose from his chair, his movements suddenly rapid and purposeful. Miss Marple, however, remained perfectly still, her knitting needles continuing their steady rhythm, though her mind was working with considerably more urgency than her hands suggested. They found Margaret's bathroom door locked from the inside. Thomas called her name repeatedly, receiving no response. It was Diana who fetched the old key from the linen closet, a skeleton key that opened most of the manor's internal locks. And it was Thomas who turned it, pushing the door open to reveal what would later be described to the police as a tragic accident. Margaret Ashworth lay in the bathtub, her dark hair floating in water that had long since cooled. An empty bottle of sleeping tablets sat on the edge of the tub. The bathroom window was closed, despite the water's steam, a detail that struck Miss Marple as significant, though she said nothing, as the household descended into the chaos of shock and recrimination. Catherine fainted, quite dramatically, into a chair. Diana knelt beside the bathtub and was sick into the toilet. Thomas stood perfectly still, his expression suggesting calculations far more complex than grief or even concern. It was Miss Marple who, with quiet authority, sent for the police and suggested to Catherine that she might wish to lie down. It was Miss Marple who remained composed while others fragmented, who observed while others reacted, who noted the particular way that Thomas's hand trembled as he poured himself a whiskey at 9:30 in the morning. And it was Miss Marple who, sitting alone in the drawing-room while the police were being summoned, understood with absolute clarity that what had been presented to them was not, in any meaningful sense, the truth. Inspector Graves arrived at Thornfield Manor at approximately 11:30, his arrival announced by the gravel of the drive crunching beneath official police tires. He was a man of 60, with the worn appearance of someone who had spent 4 decades investigating the inconsistencies between what people claimed had happened and what had actually occurred. He brought with him a sergeant, a young man named Coleman, whose primary function seemed to be writing things in a notebook while attempting to appear authoritative. The inspector's examination of the scene was thorough, but, Miss Marple observed from her position in the drawing-room doorway, fundamentally constrained by what he expected to find. The bathtub, the empty tablet bottle, the locked door, the open window that was not, in fact, open. These facts assembled themselves into a narrative of suicide so neat, so tidily arranged, that Miss Marple found herself wondering whether someone had taken considerable care to ensure their arrangement. She was not invited to observe the investigation, naturally. At 83, with trembling hands and a reputation for genteel uselessness, she was precisely the sort of person police inspectors preferred to ignore. This suited her perfectly. It was Catherine who asked her to remain, in a voice that suggested she required the presence of someone neutral, someone without obvious stake in the proceedings. Diana had been sent home by her brother, a dismissal that clearly rankled her. Thomas had secluded himself in his study with a whiskey bottle, and the kind of grief that Miss Marple suspected was performance rather than genuine emotion, though the two were often so intertwined that distinguishing between them became largely academic. By early afternoon, Inspector Graves had assembled his preliminary conclusions with the kind of confidence that suggested certainty rather than evidence. The girl, he persisted in referring to Margaret as the girl despite her being 28, had been under considerable emotional strain. The recent discovery of her inheritance, while appearing positive, had clearly triggered some underlying psychological instability. The locked door, the methodical arrangement of the tablets, the absence of any note, these were all consistent with a calculated decision to end one's life. "Tragic," he said to Catherine, his notebook already closed, "but not uncommon among women of her particular circumstances. Inheritance, you understand, does strange things to the mind, makes them aware of possibilities they'd previously been denied. Sometimes that awareness is too much." Catherine, sitting with her hands folded in her lap, accepted this interpretation with a nod that suggested relief rather than sorrow. Miss Marple, knitting steadily in the corner of the room, noted the absence of any genuine mourning. There was distress, certainly, and concern about how the scandal would affect their social standing, but the particular quality of grief, that hollow shock of unexpected loss, was entirely absent from Catherine's demeanor. "And the window?" Miss Marple asked quietly. It was the first time she had spoken since the inspector's arrival, and her voice, when it came, had that quality of elderly uncertainty that made people incline toward her as though she were slightly deaf. "I only wondered about the window. Surely if someone intended to take their own life by means of tablets, there would be no particular reason to open it. The draught would be unpleasant, and yet it was quite open when they found her, wasn't it?" Inspector Graves turned to regard Miss Marple with the kind of attention one might give a piece of furniture that had unexpectedly spoken. "The window," he repeated. "Yes. Well, the girl may have opened it for air. Tablets can cause nausea, you understand. Natural instinct to seek fresh air when one is experiencing physical distress." It was, Miss Marple reflected, a perfectly reasonable explanation. It was also entirely wrong. "Of course," she murmured, returning her attention to her knitting. "How silly of me. I'm afraid my mind does become rather circular at my age. I do apologize, Inspector." By the time Inspector Graves departed Thornfield Manor at 3:30, having spent fewer than 4 hours investigating what he had already determined was a suicide, Miss Marple had conducted her own examination of the facts. Not through active investigation, which would have been impossible, but through careful observation and the particular understanding of human nature that 60 years of village life had cultivated. The bathtub had been filled with warm water, a detail the constable had mentioned when removing the body. Warm water, in Miss Marple's experience, required time to prepare. Margaret would have needed to draw it, test the temperature, wait for it to fill to an appropriate level. This suggested planning, certainly, but also suggested a particular moment of decision, a point at which the deed had shifted from contemplation to action. Yet Margaret had received a letter from her solicitor that morning, delivered by post at 8:30. Miss Marple had observed the arrival of the postman through the guest-room window. Whatever had been written in that letter, it could not have been the catalyst for an overnight decision, which meant either Margaret had been contemplating suicide before the letter's arrival, or something else had occurred in the evening hours that had motivated the act. Thomas and Catherine's argument beneath her room suggested financial desperation. Margaret's inheritance represented either a complication or a solution to that desperation, depending on how one examined it. And Diana's convenient arrival at Margaret's door that morning, coupled with her rapid discovery of the body, raised questions about timing that Miss Marple found increasingly troubling. She excused herself at dinner, claiming fatigue, and retired to the guest room where she sat by the window, watching the darkness descend over Thornfield's perfect gardens, understanding with absolute certainty that what the village would accept as tragedy was in fact something considerably more complicated. The village of Thornfield received the news of Margaret Ashworth's death with the particular mixture of shock and excitement that such events invariably generated. By the following morning, the facts had been supplemented with considerable speculation, and by afternoon, the speculation had largely replaced the facts in the collective consciousness. Miss Marple observed this transformation with the weary familiarity of someone who had witnessed identical processes countless times in St. Mary Mead. The postmistress reported that Margaret had seemed perfectly cheerful when collecting her post the previous week. The grocer's wife swore she had noticed something rather feverish about the girl's demeanor. The vicar's wife suggested, in carefully modulated tones, that there had always been something fragile about her nature. Within 48 hours, Margaret Ashworth had been transformed from a living, complicated person into a narrative that confirmed everyone's pre-existing beliefs about what such a person must have been. It was on the third day following the discovery that Miss Marple received a visitor, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the widow of the previous vicar, and a woman of considerable intelligence paired with even more considerable discretion, appeared at Miss Marple's cottage carrying a basket of jam and an expression that suggested she had travelled with considerable purpose concealed beneath a veneer of social pleasantry. "My dear," she said, settling herself into Miss Marple's most comfortable chair with the familiarity of an old friend, "I felt I simply must visit and ensure you were managing adequately after such a dreadful shock. The Ashworths must be in quite a state." "They are managing with admirable composure," Miss Marple replied, pouring tea with steady hands. "Catherine has organized the funeral arrangements with characteristic efficiency, and Thomas has returned to his usual routines. They are remarkably resilient people." "Yes," Mrs. Hartwell said thoughtfully. "Remarkably resilient, though I confess I find myself troubled by certain aspects of this entire affair. Not that I would venture to question the inspector's conclusions, naturally. He seemed quite certain of his assessment." Miss Marple added sugar to her guest's tea with careful attention. "And yet you find yourself troubled nonetheless." "I do," Mrs. Hartwell admitted. "You see, I knew Margaret's father quite well. Thomas's brother, Charles, though the family rarely mentions him. He was a different sort of man from Thomas. Sensitive, rather more principled. He had specific intentions regarding Margaret's inheritance. He was quite explicit in his will about ensuring she would be financially independent, protected from the vicissitudes of family circumstance." "How very prescient of him," Miss Marple observed. "Indeed, which is why I found it rather curious that Catherine had been asking me, quite casually and some months ago, about the particulars of Margaret's situation. Questions about whether the girl was likely to receive substantial funds, whether she might have existing debts, that sort of thing. Perfectly innocent questions, one might say, except Catherine is not particularly interested in the affairs of others unless they directly concern her." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "People do change their patterns of interest from time to time." "They do," Mrs. Hartwell agreed, "though usually with cause. I also happen to learn, through the particular channels through which village information flows, that Thomas had been discussing certain financial difficulties with a gentleman in London. A gentleman who, it is widely understood, provides assistance to those in pressing need, provided the interest rates are substantially elevated beyond conventional standards." The afternoon light moved across Miss Marple's sitting room, casting shadows that transformed the familiar space into something more charged with possibility. She considered what Mrs. Hartwell had shared, understanding that this visit was not casual social courtesy, but rather a particular form of communication, the passing of information from one person with access to another person with perception. "You believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Margaret's death was not suicide?" Mrs. Hartwell did not answer immediately. She sipped her tea, regarded her hostess with eyes that suggested considerable age paired with undiminished acuity, and appeared to reach a decision about how much to reveal. "I believe," she said finally, that a young woman who had just learned she would have financial independence is an unlikely candidate for impulsive self-destruction. I believe that the timing of her receiving that solicitor's letter, followed within hours by her death, is suggestive of cause and effect, and I believe that there are individuals in that house who stand to benefit considerably from her removal before she could establish independent residence and control over her inheritance. The inspector seemed satisfied with his conclusions, Miss Marple observed, though her tone carried no particular confidence in that satisfaction. The inspector, Mrs. Hartwell said dryly, prefers conclusions that are tidy and involve minimal paperwork. An elderly widow's doubts would merely complicate matters, as would the doubts of any person without direct standing in the matter. However, you are living in that house, Miss Marple. You observe their routines, their behaviors, their interactions. You are precisely the sort of person who might notice what others miss. After Mrs. Hartwell departed, leaving the jam and a charged silence in her wake, Miss Marple sat by her window and watched the evening descend over Thornfield. She thought about the locked door and the warm water. She thought about Diana's convenient discovery of the body. She thought about the particular desperation in Thomas's voice when he had argued with Catherine about Margaret's inheritance, and she understood, with the clarity that only comes from decades of observing human nature, that the village had been offered a false narrative, and that the inspector's satisfaction with that narrative made it unlikely to be questioned by official channels. Which meant, she reflected, that the truth would require considerably more delicate investigation than the authorities would provide. The funeral service for Margaret Ashworth took place on a grey November afternoon in the small stone church that dominated Thornfield's village square. The pews filled with the customary assemblage of mourners, some genuinely bereaved, others attending out of obligation or morbid curiosity, and still others present primarily to observe how the family would comport themselves during this public performance of grief. Miss Marple sat toward the rear, her hymn book held at the appropriate angle, her expression reflecting the dignified sorrow that such occasions demanded. The vicar, a younger man who had replaced Mrs. Hartwell's late husband, delivered a eulogy that was notably vague about Margaret's actual character, focusing instead on abstract concepts of youth, tragedy, and the inscrutability of divine will. He mentioned neither her intelligence nor her apparent unhappiness, neither her recent inheritance nor the questions that swirled around the circumstances of her death. It was, Miss Marple reflected, the sort of eulogy designed to offend no one and illuminate nothing. Thomas sat in the front pew with Catherine beside him, her black dress impeccable, her posture perfect, her face arranged in an expression of appropriate devastation. Diana occupied the seat beyond Catherine, her jaw tight, her hands gripping her handbag with considerable force. To the casual observer, they presented the image of a family united in grief. To Miss Marple's considerably less casual observation, they presented the image of people engaged in a complex negotiation conducted through the medium of public appearance. It was after the service, at the cemetery, that Miss Marple made her first deliberate move. As the coffin was lowered into the ground and the assembled mourners recited the committal prayers, she positioned herself beside Diana Marchmont and, with the particular diffidence that age permitted, leaned toward her. "Such a dreadful business," she murmured. "Though I confess I have been wondering about certain details. You discovered her, I believe?" Diana's body stiffened almost imperceptibly. "I did, yes. A dreadful shock." "I imagine it must have been," Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the quality of someone thinking aloud rather than interrogating. "Though I was puzzled by one small thing. You mentioned the water was running when you put your ear to the door. I've always understood that water running from a tap creates quite a specific sound, rather loud and rather distinctive. Yet if Margaret had already taken the tablets and entered the bath, she would have been drowsy, one would think. It seems curious that she would have left the water running afterward." I didn't think to question such things," Diana said carefully. "One doesn't think clearly in moments of shock. No, indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Though in my experience, shock often sharpens certain aspects of memory while dulling others. You seem to remember quite clearly that the water had been running for at least 10 minutes, which suggests considerable observation, despite the shock you were experiencing. Diana turned away without responding, moving toward where Thomas and Catherine stood accepting condolences from the village's more prominent citizens. Miss Marple watched her go with the satisfaction of someone who had planted a seed and could afford to wait for it to germinate. That evening, Miss Marple returned to Thornfield Manor. She had been invited to remain as a guest through the funeral period, Catherine having discovered that Miss Marple's quiet presence was oddly soothing to the household's fractured atmosphere, and found Thomas alone in his study, a considerable quantity of whiskey apparently having been consumed in her absence. "Miss Marple," he said, his words carrying the slight blur that indicated either genuine intoxication or a convincing performance of it. "Come to pay your respects to the bereaved. How terribly kind of you." "I wondered," Miss Marple said, settling herself in the chair opposite his desk, "whether I might impose upon your time with a rather delicate question. I've been troubled by something, you see, and I find myself unable to let the matter rest. At my age, one develops a rather intense dislike of unresolved concerns." Thomas gestured expansively, his gesture suggesting he was either too drunk or too grief-stricken to maintain his usual guard. "Ask away, my dear woman. What could possibly trouble you?" "The will," Miss Marple said gently. "Margaret's inheritance. Mrs. Hartwell happened to mention that Charles, your brother, had been quite specific in his provisions. I wondered whether Margaret had actually taken possession of the funds, or whether they remained in some form of trust." The effect of this question on Thomas was immediate and considerable. His hand, which had been raised to his mouth, froze at the midpoint of its trajectory. His eyes, which had been unfocused and vague, suddenly focused with sharp intensity. "That," he said slowly, "is a remarkably perceptive question for someone supposedly interested merely in making conversation." "I have found," Miss Marple replied, "that people often reveal considerably more through the questions they ask than through the answers they provide. And I have also found that Margaret's death, occurring as it did mere hours after she received communication from her solicitor regarding her inheritance, raises certain logical questions." "Are you suggesting," Thomas said carefully, setting down his glass, "that there is something suspicious about my niece's death?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple corrected gently, "that there are certain inconsistencies in the narrative we have been offered. The warm water, for instance, the locked door, the particular timing of Diana's discovery. These details, taken individually, are not necessarily problematic. Taken collectively, however, they suggest a pattern that a more thorough investigation might wish to examine." Thomas rose from his chair and moved to the window, his silhouette dark against the November evening. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality of something between resignation and relief. "You understand," he said, "that some truths are considerably more dangerous than the comfortable fictions we tell ourselves?" "I do," Miss Marple replied, "but I also understand that comfortable fictions have a peculiar way of unraveling, often at precisely the moment when someone believes them most secure." Thomas remained at the window for a considerable length of time, his shoulders bearing the weight of a decision that appeared to be causing him considerable internal conflict. Miss Marple waited with the patience of someone for whom time was a commodity she had learned not to squander on haste. Outside, the November darkness had become complete, the gardens of Thornfield Manor dissolving into shadow. "You are a remarkable woman," Thomas said finally, turning to face her. "Remarkable and, I suspect, considerably dangerous to those with secrets they wish to maintain." "I am merely an old woman," Miss Marple replied, "who has lived long enough to understand that human beings are far more consistent in their behaviors than they themselves believe. We repeat our patterns, Mr. Ashworth. We commit the same errors, motivated by the same fears and desires, regardless of how different our circumstances might appear." "And what pattern do you believe I've committed?" Thomas asked, returning to his chair. He did not pour another whiskey, which Miss Marple took as a sign that some portion of his mind was becoming clearer. "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that you have been in financial difficulty for some time. I believe that Margaret's inheritance represented either a solution to that difficulty or a complication of it, depending on circumstances, and I believe that someone in this household believed her death would facilitate their access to funds they believed themselves entitled to receive." "You believe Catherine murdered her?" Thomas said flatly. "I believe," Miss Marple corrected, "that certain circumstances suggest a possibility that the official investigation chose not to explore. What I do not yet understand is your own role in the matter. Are you protecting someone you love, Mr. Ashworth, or are you simply ensuring that certain uncomfortable truths remain buried?" Thomas poured himself a fresh whiskey, not bothering this time to offer any pretense of reluctance. He drank it quickly, as though swallowing something distasteful. "Charles's will," he said, "contained provisions that I did not fully understand until recently. The inheritance was not left to Margaret directly. It was placed in trust to be managed by a trustee appointed by Charles himself. That trustee was, and remains, Diana." The statement hung in the air between them like a revelation that altered the entire configuration of the puzzle. Miss Marple's needles, which had been working steadily throughout their conversation, paused in their motion. "Miss Diana Marchmont is the trustee of Margaret's inheritance." "Precisely. Which means that Margaret had no immediate access to those funds. They would have been distributed according to the terms of the trust, likely when she reached 30, or upon her marriage, or upon certain other contingencies. Margaret would have been informed of this by her solicitor. She would have understood that despite her inheritance, she was not, in fact, financially independent. But if she believed herself to be without independent means," Miss Marple said slowly, "then her suicide becomes considerably more plausible. A young woman receiving news that she remains dependent on family goodwill might indeed find that psychologically destabilizing." "Precisely," Thomas repeated, "which is why the official narrative remains untouched. Everyone believes Margaret took her own life upon learning the disappointing truth about her inheritance. No one questions the convenient timing. No one examines the impossibilities inherent in the scenario." "And yet you are telling me this now," Miss Marple observed. "Why would you reveal information that protects your family's reputation?" Thomas stood abruptly and moved to a small safe concealed behind a painting on the wall. He opened it with trembling hands and withdrew a letter, which he extended toward Miss Marple. "Because," he said, "Diana left this in the drawing room 2 days ago. Because Catherine found it and showed it to me, and because I have spent the intervening time understanding that I have been complicit in something considerably worse than financial desperation." The letter was handwritten on expensive stationery, addressed to someone named James in London. Miss Marple recognized the hand as Diana's from her observation of the funeral guest book the previous day. "My dearest," it began, "the situation has been resolved as we discussed. Margaret proved to be considerably more naive than we anticipated. She believed the water running was for her comfort, that the tablets was something to help her sleep. She never understood what was actually occurring until it was far too late. The inheritance reverts to Thomas under the trust's contingency clause, and you will receive your payment as promised. By the time anyone examines the matter closely, the evidence will have deteriorated beyond recovery. We have been extraordinarily careful." Miss Marple read the letter twice, her mind working through the implications with systematic precision. Diana and someone named James, a man apparently, who had been retained through some prior arrangement. The letter suggested premeditation, careful planning, and an understanding of trust law that Diana had undoubtedly possessed, given her role as trustee. "She gave Margaret sleeping tablets," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "But not in the manner Margaret believed. Diana had become quite friendly with her, you understand? They had tea together the afternoon before the death. The tablets were administered gradually, throughout the afternoon, in small amounts mixed into cakes and biscuits. By evening, Margaret was sufficiently sedated that she was compliant, suggestible, barely aware of what was occurring. "And the bathtub," Miss Marple said, understanding now the full configuration of the crime. Diana filled it with warm water while Margaret was in that state. She placed Margaret in it, ensured the water filled her lungs, and then departed to establish her discovery the following morning. The locked door was accomplished with Diana's own key. Margaret never locked her door at all. Diana locked it from the outside after leaving, then unlocked it from inside that morning to create the appearance she discovered it locked. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. And this James, what was his role? "Diana's partner," Thomas said. "In both the criminal and romantic sense. He has apparently since disappeared, leaving Diana to manage the consequences alone. She sent that letter in a state of emotional distress. Perhaps guilt, perhaps rage at his abandonment. I don't know." "Then we must contact Inspector Graves immediately," Miss Marple said, rising to her feet with surprising steadiness. "And reveal that my sister-in-law murdered her ward for financial gain." Thomas's laugh was bitter. "And that I, aware of the truth, allowed the official narrative to stand." "That makes me complicit, Miss Marple. That makes me guilty of obstruction at minimum." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed simply. "It does. Which is precisely why you will do it now, before your courage fails again." Inspector Graves arrived at Thornfield Manor for the second time in a week, with considerably more skepticism than he had demonstrated during his initial investigation. The letter had been sufficient to motivate his return, though his expression suggested he regarded the entire matter as an inconvenient complication to a case he had already closed to his satisfaction. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, settling himself in the study with the air of a man preparing to listen to an explanation he had already determined was unlikely to be credible. "You are now suggesting that your sister-in-law, a woman of considerable standing in this community, deliberately poisoned her ward and arranged the scene to appear as suicide. This is quite a serious allegation." "It is," Thomas agreed, "which is why I'm providing you with the letter, the handwriting analysis of which will confirm Diana's authorship, and my testimony regarding the financial motivations for the crime." "Financial motivations that also implicate you," the inspector noted, his tone carrying an edge that suggested Thomas's position was considerably more precarious than it had been moments before. "You benefit from Margaret's death, do you not? The trust reverts to you under the contingency clause Miss Marchmont references." "I do," Thomas admitted. "Which is why I also must inform you that I was aware of Miss Marchmont's actions and chose to remain silent. I am prepared to face whatever legal consequences result from that choice." Miss Marple, who had been invited to remain present during this conversation, a choice that suggested Thomas had understood the importance of having a witness of unquestionable credibility, observed the inspector's reaction with interest. He was attempting to calculate whether Thomas's confession of obstruction was genuine or merely another layer of deception, whether the letter was authentic or an elaborate fabrication designed to redirect suspicion. "Where is Miss Marchmont now?" the inspector asked finally. "In her cottage in the village," Thomas replied, "though I suspect she may flee once she becomes aware that we have disclosed the letter's contents to you." The inspector rose with the decisive movement of a man who had gathered sufficient information to warrant taking action, whatever his private doubts about the matter's veracity. He departed within 10 minutes, taking the letter with him and leaving behind an atmosphere of considerable tension. It was Catherine who confronted Miss Marple that evening, finding her in the drawing-room where she had settled with her knitting, as though the day had been entirely ordinary. "You did this," Catherine said, her usual composure shattered, her voice trembling with something that might have been rage or might have been desperation. "You came into this house as a guest and set about dismantling everything. You knew. You knew from the beginning, didn't you?" "I knew very little from the beginning," Miss Marple replied calmly, continuing her work with the knitting needles. "I observed certain inconsistencies. I listened to what people were not saying, and I understood that a young woman does not typically commit suicide within hours of learning that she will remain financially dependent. That pattern does not match human nature as I have come to understand it. You destroyed us, Catherine continued, moving closer, her fists clenched. We would have been fine. We would have managed. Diana would have controlled the trust as she had planned. Funds would have been released gradually. Our financial difficulties would have been resolved. No one else needed to suffer. No one else needed to die, you mean, Miss Marple corrected gently. Margaret Ashworth was a young woman with her entire life before her. She had done nothing to deserve the fate that was arranged for her, and your financial difficulties, while real, do not justify her murder. Catherine's expression shifted from anger to something more closely resembling collapse. She sank into a chair, her body suddenly appearing to weigh far more than it physically could. I didn't know, she whispered. When Diana first suggested it, I thought she was merely joking. When she began to implement the plan, I told her it was madness, but she was so certain, so convinced that it would appear as suicide, that no one would question it. And Thomas needed the money so desperately. The debts were becoming impossible to manage. Did your husband know? Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer. Not initially. Diana acted largely without his knowledge. But yes, once Margaret died and he understood what had occurred, he became aware of the full circumstances, and he chose silence because the alternative was destroying his family completely. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. Your family was already destroyed the moment Diana decided to murder Margaret. What occurred afterward was merely the final accounting of that destruction. It was Diana who fled, exactly as Thomas had predicted. By the following morning, she had departed her cottage with a single bag and left behind no indication of her intended destination. The constable discovered her gone when he attempted to serve her with a warrant for questioning. The search for her would eventually extend to the continent, though it would be nearly 18 months before she was discovered living under an assumed name in a small village in Provence, where she would be arrested and extradited to face trial. The trial itself became a considerable scandal, the sort of affair that occupied the national newspapers for weeks and provided the sort of sensational entertainment that the British public found endlessly fascinating. Diana Marchmont was revealed to be a woman of considerable intelligence paired with equally considerable moral vacancy. Her accomplice, James Whitmore, was discovered in Paris, where he was living quite comfortably on funds Diana had provided prior to her own flight. The evidence was overwhelming. The letter, the traces of sedative compounds found in the bathtub, the testimony of the chemist who had provided Diana with the tablets under false pretenses. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, her fate sealed by the very letter she had written in a moment of emotional volatility. Thomas Ashworth faced charges of obstruction and was ultimately sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment, a consequence he accepted with the demeanor of a man who understood himself to be fortunate that the sentence was not considerably more severe. Catherine retreated into a form of social withdrawal, rarely leaving Thornfield Manor and speaking to almost no one of what had occurred. It was Miss Marple who returned to her cottage with a sense of completion, understanding that she had fulfilled the obligation that justice required, even though justice itself remained an imperfect and often disappointing instrument. The winter that followed Margaret Ashworth's death descended upon Thornfield with the kind of bleakness that seemed to reflect the moral landscape of the village itself. Snow came early, heavy and persistent, transforming the perfectly maintained gardens of Thornfield Manor into a wasteland of white that obscured the lines and geometries Catherine had once taken such pride in maintaining. Miss Marple, observing from her cottage window, reflected that nature had a peculiar way of erasing human pretension when given sufficient opportunity. Mrs. Hartwell visited on a grey afternoon in mid-December, bringing with her a Christmas cake and an expression that suggested considerable satisfaction at having her initial suspicions validated, though she was tactful enough not to say so explicitly. "The village is quite divided in its opinions," she reported, settling herself with tea in Miss Marple's sitting room. "Some believe Diana Marchmont was a monster acting alone. Others contend that Thomas and Catherine were equally culpable and somehow escaped appropriate punishment through the intervention of clever lawyers. Still, others prefer to believe the entire affair was some sort of misunderstanding that has been grotesquely amplified. People believe what allows them to continue living without excessive discomfort," Miss Marple observed. "It is a fundamental aspect of human nature that I have found remarkably consistent across all social circumstances." "And yet you were willing to disrupt that comfortable discomfort," Mrs. Hartwell said. "You were willing to expose the truth, knowing it would create considerably more disturbance than the false narrative that preceded it." Miss Marple considered this assessment while pouring fresh tea. "I was willing to ensure that a young woman's death was not rendered meaningless by being absorbed into a convenient fiction. Whether that action was morally justified, or merely an old woman's indulgence in her own sense of righteousness, I cannot entirely say." "I think you can," Mrs. Hartwell replied. "I think you knew precisely what you were doing and why. You recognized a pattern of behavior that suggested guilt, and you pursued it despite knowing the consequences would be considerable and largely unpleasant." The conversation turned to other matters: the village gossip, the expected arrival of new residents to replace those who had fled to London following the scandal, the likelihood that the vicar would be transferred to a different parish now that his church had been so thoroughly associated with murder and deceit. But Miss Marple's mind remained partially engaged with the larger questions that the case had raised. Questions about the nature of justice, the possibility of redemption, and whether an old woman's observations constituted sufficient basis for disrupting lives. It was Thomas Ashworth himself who provided the unexpected coda to the affair. He arrived at Miss Marple's cottage 3 weeks before his sentencing, driving himself in his motor car with the careful precision of someone attempting to appear completely composed while harboring significant internal turmoil. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room, offering tea which he declined, and settling herself with her knitting as though the visit were entirely ordinary. "I wanted to thank you," he said without preamble, "and simultaneously to tell you that I believe you may have committed a considerable injustice, and these two impulses are warring within me in ways that make coherent speech rather difficult." "Please proceed," Miss Marple said gently. "Incoherence is often considerably more honest than careful articulation." Thomas sat on the edge of her sofa, his posture suggesting he might depart at any moment. "You forced me to confront what I had become. A man willing to allow murder to remain unpunished for financial gain. A man willing to prioritize his own comfort over a young woman's life and the truth of her death. That confrontation has been profoundly unpleasant, but I suspect it was necessary." "And the injustice?" Miss Marple prompted. "My sentence is relatively light compared to Diana's, which is theoretically appropriate given my lesser direct involvement in Margaret's death. But I am simultaneously being punished for revealing the truth while Catherine, who was arguably more aware of Diana's intentions than I was, will face no legal consequences whatsoever. Justice, it appears, is considerably more arbitrary than I had previously appreciated." "Justice," Miss Marple agreed, "is always arbitrary. It depends on who has the power to enforce it, what evidence is available to substantiate claims, and what society is willing to acknowledge as requiring punishment. That arbitrariness is one of the more frustrating aspects of attempting to pursue truth." "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked. "Pursuing the truth in this case?" Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded her visitor with a clear-eyed attention that suggested she was considering the question with genuine seriousness. "I regret the suffering that has resulted. I regret Catherine's collapse into semi-functional existence. I regret that you will spend 2 years in imprisonment for a crime in which you were complicit rather than perpetrative. But I do not regret that Margaret Ashworth's death has been properly accounted for, that her murder has not been absorbed into a narrative of suicide designed for convenience. Some forms of regret are worth bearing." Thomas nodded slowly, as though absorbing this assessment and finding it both unsatisfactory and unavoidable. He rose to depart, pausing at the doorway. "I wonder," he said, "whether you always knew the truth. Whether you came to Thornfield already understanding what would occur and simply waited for it to manifest itself." "I knew nothing with certainty," Miss Marple replied. "I observed patterns. I listened carefully. I asked questions that others had not thought to ask. The truth emerged through a process of elimination rather than through prescience. But I will confess that once I understood Diana's role as trustee, many previously unexplained elements began to align themselves in ways that suggested a particular narrative." After he departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, understanding that whatever judgments might be rendered in courtrooms would ultimately be less significant than the judgments each individual would render upon themselves when confronted with their own complicity in evil. Thomas Ashworth would spend his 2 years in prison not primarily because society required it, but because he would require it of himself, a form of self-imposed penance for having chosen silence when courage was required. Spring arrived in Thornfield with the particular insistence of English renewal, transforming the bleak winter landscape into something approaching beauty. The snow melted, revealing the gardens beneath in states ranging from dormancy to tentative awakening. Miss Marple observed this transformation from her cottage window with the detached appreciation of someone who understood that nature's cycles operated according to their own logic, indifferent to human moral failures or legal resolutions. Catherine Ashworth had begun to emerge from her withdrawal, though in a form considerably diminished from her previous existence. She was seen occasionally in the village, moving through the shops with the careful movements of someone navigating terrain they no longer entirely recognized. Her appearance, once meticulously maintained, had acquired a quality of deliberate neglect, as though she had decided that the effort required to maintain her former standards was no longer worth the expenditure. It was Mrs. Ashworth who requested Miss Marple's company one afternoon in early April, a request delivered through a note written in handwriting that trembled slightly, suggesting either advancing age or considerable emotional disturbance. Miss Marple accepted, though she approached the matter with the understanding that this meeting would likely prove uncomfortable for all parties involved. Catherine received her in the drawing-room, which appeared somehow smaller than Miss Marple remembered it, as though the scandal had compressed the physical space along with compressing the emotional atmosphere. Catherine herself seemed similarly reduced, her frame appearing almost insubstantial in the spring light that streamed through the windows. "I wanted to speak with you," Catherine began, her voice carrying the quality of someone who had rehearsed these opening words extensively, "before Thomas completes his sentence, before he returns and this house must attempt to reassemble itself into some form of functional existence." Miss Marple accepted the offered chair, declining tea with a gentle gesture. She understood that Catherine required an audience rather than a guest, a witness rather than a conversational partner. "I have been attempting to understand," Catherine continued, "what transformation occurred in me that allowed me to remain silent while a young woman was murdered. That allowed me to accept the official narrative of suicide despite knowing it to be false. That permitted me to function as though nothing extraordinary had occurred while Margaret's body was barely cold in the ground. The transformation," Miss Marple said gently, "likely began considerably before Margaret's death. It began the moment financial desperation became the lens through which you viewed all moral questions." "Yes," Catherine agreed, and there was something almost like relief in her acknowledgement. "Yes, I suppose it did. I remember the exact moment I understood we were in genuine difficulty. Thomas had always managed our finances, you understand? I had never concerned myself with such practical matters. And then one day he told me we were spending considerably more than we were receiving, that our reserves were depleting, that we faced ruin if something did not change." She paused, her gaze moving toward the window where the gardens were visible, no longer perfectly maintained, but not yet entirely abandoned either. "I became obsessed," Catherine continued, "with the idea that Margaret's inheritance represented a solution. Not that we would take it from her, you understand, but that once she was established independently, she would cease to be a financial burden on this household. That her father's provisions would mean she would no longer require our support or our charity. I rationalized it as concern for her well-being when it was actually concern for our own. And when Diana suggested something more direct, Miss Marple prompted. I told myself it was madness, that she was joking, that no one would actually contemplate such an action. But part of me, a part I am ashamed to acknowledge even now, understood that I wanted to believe her, that I wanted to believe it was possible, that desperate hope and deliberate blindness became increasingly difficult to distinguish. Catherine's hands, folded in her lap, began to tremble, and she gripped them tightly as though attempting to contain some internal rupture that threatened to become visible. "I've been attempting to understand," she said, "whether I am a murderer. Whether remaining silent when one possesses knowledge of a crime makes one equally culpable. Whether the legal system's determination that I am innocent absolves me of actual guilt. Those," Miss Marple said, "are questions that only you can answer. The legal system provides a framework for determining culpability, but moral accountability operates according to different principles." "Which is why I have decided to confess," Catherine said quietly. "To tell the authorities everything I knew, everything I suspected, everything I chose to ignore, to ensure that the record reflects my complicity rather than my ostensible innocence." Miss Marple regarded her guest with an expression that combined compassion with clarity. "That is a courageous choice. It will likely result in legal consequences you cannot currently predict. It will certainly result in considerable social stigma. The village will not forgive you for this additional revelation." "No," Catherine agreed, "but I suspect I may eventually forgive myself, which is considerably more important than the village's forgiveness. And I suspect that Margaret's parents, wherever they are in whatever afterlife may exist, would prefer to have their daughter's death accounted for completely, rather than having a portion of it concealed to protect my reputation and my freedom." She rose from her chair with the careful movements of someone whose body had become an unreliable instrument. Miss Marple understood this to be a dismissal, and she departed with the understanding that Catherine Ashworth had made a decision that would reshape the remainder of her life. The woman who emerged from legal proceedings following her confession would be someone fundamentally transformed, someone who had accepted that complicity in evil carried consequences that extended beyond courtrooms and into the domain of personal conscience. As Miss Marple walked back toward her cottage through the spring afternoon, she reflected that sometimes justice required not brilliant deduction, but simply the willingness of guilty parties to finally acknowledge their guilt. Catherine's confession would become the final piece in the puzzle that had begun with a teacup placed slightly to the left of its saucer. The final section of the story concludes with Miss Marple's reflection on the case, bringing closure to the narrative while maintaining the essence of Agatha Christie's detective work. Here is the concluding section. The autumn following Catherine's confession arrived with a particular quality of melancholy that seemed appropriate to the resolution of the Thornfield affair. The case, which had occupied the attention of the national press for nearly a year, had gradually receded from public consciousness as newer scandals emerged to capture the public imagination. But in the village itself, the consequences of Margaret Ashworth's death remained visible in the altered landscape of daily life. Diana Marchmont was serving her sentence in a women's prison in the Midlands, her appeals having been systematically rejected by increasingly higher courts. Her accomplice, James Whitmore, had received a similar sentence, though he had proven considerably less resilient than Diana under the conditions of imprisonment. There had been reports of suicide attempts, of mental deterioration, of a man systematically dismantled by the weight of acknowledged guilt. Catherine Ashworth had been sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment, a consequence that had shocked the village less through its severity than through its inevitability. She had accepted the sentence with the composed demeanor of someone who had already served a considerably harsher judgment upon herself. Her solicitors indicated she would likely serve no more than 3 years, given her age and her cooperation with authorities. But Catherine herself seemed indifferent to the calculations of legal reduction. Thomas Ashworth had completed his sentence and returned to Thornfield Manor, to a house substantially altered by the departures and revelations of the preceding months. He had aged considerably during his imprisonment, his bearing no longer carrying the assurance of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He had sold considerable portions of the estate and donated them to various charitable organizations, a choice that suggested either genuine reformation or an elaborate performance of it. It was on a Thursday afternoon in October when Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. A young man, appearing to be in his late 20s, presented himself at her cottage with the diffidence of someone uncertain of his reception. He introduced himself as Richard Ashworth, Thomas's son from his first marriage, Margaret's half-brother, though the family connection had been deliberately obscured throughout the years prior to Margaret's death. "I wanted to thank you," he said, settling himself in the familiar chair opposite Miss Marple's, "for ensuring that my sister's death received proper accounting. I was abroad when it occurred, serving with the military in Cyprus. By the time I returned, the case had ostensibly been closed. I might never have learned the truth had you not pursued it. Your father eventually told you the full circumstances?" Miss Marple inquired. "He did, though it required considerable time before he felt capable of discussing the matter. He has spent the past months attempting to understand how his desperation led him to such moral compromise. I believe he is slowly arriving at a form of genuine understanding rather than mere rationalization." Miss Marple offered tea, which Richard accepted, and they sat in companionable silence for several minutes before he continued. "I've been attempting to establish a scholarship in Margaret's name," he said, "to provide educational opportunities for young women who might otherwise lack them. It seemed the most appropriate way to honor her memory, to ensure that she is remembered as something more than a victim of a crime." "That is a worthy undertaking," Miss Marple replied. "Your sister would likely have appreciated the gesture." "I've also been attempting to understand," Richard continued, "what patterns of behavior led to such catastrophic failure among people who are not inherently evil. My father is not a murderer. My stepmother is not a criminal. My aunt was not born with the capacity to commit deliberate murder. And yet all three found themselves complicit in something profoundly wrong." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Human beings," she said, "are remarkably consistent in their ability to rationalize behavior that contradicts their self-image. We tell ourselves stories about ourselves, narratives that allow us to believe we are good people engaged in reasonable actions. It is only when confronted with undeniable evidence of our own capacity for moral failure that we occasionally begin to examine those narratives." "And do you believe my family members have genuinely examined themselves?" Richard asked. "Or are they simply performing examination, play-acting contrition?" "That," Miss Marple said gently, "is something only they can answer through the accumulation of their subsequent choices. Transformation is not an event. It is a process. The question is whether they will commit themselves to that process or retreat into the comfort of their original narratives." Richard departed as the afternoon light began its inevitable fade toward evening. Miss Marple watched him leave with the understanding that he represented something that the tragedy had produced. A younger generation determined not to repeat the failures of their predecessors, committed to ensuring that Margaret's death would generate some meaningful alteration in the world rather than merely being absorbed into history as another unsolved mystery that society had learned to tolerate. In the weeks that followed, Miss Marple maintained her quiet routine in the cottage, knitting her lavender cardigans, observing the village with the patient attention that had characterized her entire life. She received occasional correspondence from Inspector Graves, who appeared to have developed a respect for her investigative methods despite his initial skepticism. She attended the dedication of the Margaret Ashworth Scholarship Fund, an event that drew considerable attention from the educational establishment. and comparatively less from the village itself. But it was on a cold December evening, as Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the winter descend, that she allowed herself to reflect on the essential nature of what had occurred. A young woman had been murdered by someone she trusted in circumstances designed to conceal the crime through the appearance of suicide. That crime had been uncovered not through forensic brilliance or technological sophistication, but through careful observation of human behavior and the recognition that people, regardless of their education or social standing, repeated patterns of motivation and action that were remarkably consistent. The teacup placed slightly to the left of its saucer had been the beginning of everything, not because it was particularly significant in itself, but because it had represented a deviation from the patterns that Miss Marple had learned to recognize through 70 years of careful observation. In the end, she reflected, all mysteries were simply departures from expected patterns, and all solutions were simply the restoration of those patterns to comprehensibility. The village of Thornfield would move forward, bearing the scar of the scandal but gradually integrating it into the larger narrative of village history. New residents would arrive, new gossip would emerge, new secrets would be buried beneath new facades of respectability, and Miss Marple, as always, would observe, listen, and wait for the next deviation from pattern that would require her attention.